welcome to our monthly Tuesdays With, here sponsored by the Friends of the Georgetown Library. I'm Bob Willey, and I'm privileged to serve as the president of the Friends of the Georgetown Library, and we welcome you to join us this day for our Tuesdays With. It's just a great opportunity to be able to share some intellect and education and opportunities of learning here in the Georgetown Library. Tuesdays With is based on the title of a best-selling book in 1997, Tuesdays with Maury by Mitch Albom, a bestseller in 1997, and a great book which talks about the wonderful ongoing relationship between a student and professor long after college years. And we chose that title because that's what our series is all about. Continued learning, ongoing learning that is our privilege, our opportunity, especially to get to know more about Georgetown and Georgetown County. So we're glad that you're with us today for this next in our series of lectures from the Georgetown Library. Today we have Tuesdays with Jim Lee. Jim is the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center. Does wonderful tours. I've had that opportunity to be a part of the tours there, and not only that, but also is a great bus driver as well, as he takes you around that area of the center. Our title today is The Yawkey Family, Their Impact on Georgetown County. We welcome today Jim Lee. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks to the Friends Group for this opportunity. You know, I think it's at your urging, Bob, that I finally decided to, get down and do a presentation entirely based on Tom Yawkey. So I've covered different aspects on the property with different groups, but really haven't focused solely on the person of Tom Yawkey. And I think events in recent years have led me to want to undertake this also. The thing that slowed me up, I think, for a while is that Yawkey's pretty well known in a lot of circles around Georgetown. There's a lot of my colleagues that knew him personally and know a lot more about him than I do. So I was kind of hesitant and felt like maybe I'd be stepping on somebody else's toes by coming out and sharing this information. But I've discovered that Mr. Yawkey and I have some things in common, which I think leaves me a little more qualified. Yawkey enjoyed spending time outdoors every single day. He was out hunting, he was fishing, out just riding around, walking through the woods. It was just a big part of his life. And it helped him succeed in a lot of different areas. And so we share that love of the outdoors together. I've been with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources for 38 years, which is a lot of time spent in a lot of really neat places, and worked with some really great folks. And now I'm offered the opportunity to share some of the things that I've uncovered and discovered along the way, and share these with other people, young people, middle-aged people, older people, people that can't get around very well, and it's helped to kind of expose them to some things that were right in their backyard, and they just didn't know about it because nobody took the time to share it with them. I joke sometimes that I spend a lot of time on the short bus, which was kind of a joke growing up if you had to be on the short bus, but I drive the thing, as Bob mentioned, so that's okay. And spend the bulk of my time out at the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center. Rain or shine, even a little bit of snow. I never thought I'd do a trip out there in the snow, but it was a lot of fun and got to see it in a little bit different light. So we need to talk about the life of Tom Yawkey. A lot of people around Georgetown might have thought that Yawkey was a Yankee, and he comes down to Georgetown to duck hunt and drink liquor, and then he goes back north again. But he really considered himself a part of this community for a long time. He's first introduced to the neighborhood, if you will, and the community when he's about a 10-year-old boy, and enjoyed making the trips down with his Uncle Bill. That's Uncle Bill on his left up there. Uncle Bill was a part owner of what we call the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center. Today it was known as a South Island Hunting Club back in his time. And he's a businessman with interest all over the Midwest and Northeast. Really a neat guy. And he takes young Tom under his wing, as Tom had lost his own father when he was very young. Tom grows up both in New York City and then also in Georgetown. He would have spent time as a young man working in coal mines, working in timber operations, so we could get an idea about what that family business was all about. When he's a young man, 15 years old or so, his mother dies, and it's pretty devastating for him. Uncle Bill would adopt him, but within 6 months of the adoption, Uncle Bill dies. And this is during that Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, so we can probably relate to what was going on in his life. Young Tom probably searching for a family identity, and he would find his new family right here in Georgetown. And it was the people that lived on Cat Island and South Island. He was very well acquainted with them, and they had suffered similar losses during that pandemic. And so it kind of forms a tragic bond early in his life with these people that come from completely different backgrounds than he did. But it's a bond that cements that family relationship that would last for the rest of his life. Tom would be sent off to a boarding school, which was pretty common in those days. He goes to the Union Academy up in Tarrytown, New York, and his professors described him as very studious, a very promising student with a bright future. He would attend Yale University, and I think that's him right there. You can see in the photograph. And would have enjoyed fraternity life there on Yale's campus. He graduates cum laude in 1925 with a degree in engineering. He's a pretty smart guy. And upon his graduation, he's also given an opportunity to buy into this set of islands and wetlands and uplands that had been the South Island Hunting Club. His uncle had owned a share of it, and then Yawkey buys out the remaining shares, and at the tender age of 23 becomes the sole proprietor of about 80% of what we call the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center today. If you're wondering where all this money came from, Grandfather Yawkey is the one that kind of gets the family business started. At the close of the Civil War, Grandfather Yawkey begins to collect some of these land warrants that had been given to U.S. servicemen at the end of the Civil War. And these were the boys from Boston and Philadelphia and New York that didn't necessarily want to become a pioneer farmer in Wisconsin or Indiana or wherever these places might have been. So, but he takes these land warrants up into the Great North Woods and begins cutting timber. And then they discover the mineral wealth under that timberland, and that's where the basis of all their wealth arises. And one of the neatest things is all of that money that Grandfather Yawkey started out with is still hard at work, much of it right here in Georgetown County. And for that fortune to remain intact like that is a testament to their productivity and their integrity over time as well. Also, when Yawkey graduates from Yale, he gets married. He marries Miss Elise Sparrow. Elise was from Alabama. She attended University of Alabama. Tom jokingly called her the fireman's daughter, but she was a fine young woman, and they made an exceptional couple. They would move, of course, to South Island. They would spend at least 6 months a year here in Georgetown, and they considered Georgetown home. He may have had a legal address in New York, but home is where your guns and your dogs and your books are. And all of that stuff's not in New York. All of that is here. One of the first things they would do once they got settled in their new home is meet with the residents of the Maxwell Village, where most of the people on Cat Island lived at the time, and they asked those leaders of that community what they needed most to make life better. And the leaders decided what they needed most was a church. So in 1928, Tom and Elise offered these people the church that still stands today and looks almost exactly the same as it did back then. Elise becomes kind of the belle of the village down there. She loved those people dearly, and they loved her equally. She came from a rural part of Alabama. She was used to Southern culture and black culture, so it wasn't hard for her to immediately blend in, and it was just part of her nature, I think. The Yawkeys would attend services at that little church from time to time, knew everybody that lived in that village. Every year at Christmas, every child that lived on Cat Island or South Island got a wrapped gift with their name on it. So it wasn't just a little token gift, but something that they knew those kids would really like. Another thing that Tom Yawkey does early on, this is, if you see the date on that, it's February 23rd, 1926. And Tom's just been on South Island as the owner for just months. But he's already contracted with a consultant from up in Wisconsin because he want to make those wetlands that support so much of the wildlife there better places. And he would spend close to $2,000 in 1926 on seeds, roots, tubers, and plants to make all of these managed wetlands down there richer and better for waterfowl, and not just for waterfowl either. You know, he's attracted to the property because of the hunting opportunities, as a lot of people would have been during his era. And there were plenty of ducks there, but he wasn't satisfied with just having it just the way it was. He knew there was ways to improve it. And this pattern of improving and experimenting and researching takes root in the early 20s, and he carries on in that same fashion until his death in 1976. He never let his foot off the gas in that regard. But he understood early on that there was a lot more to managing wetlands for waterfowl than just ducks. And he knew there were a lot of other components of these wetlands, and he sought protection for some of these other parts of the ecosystem down there. Not only just the notables like eagles, but marsh birds and shorebirds, other migratories that came through. So he would manage simultaneously 4 waterfowl, 4 shorebirds, 4 marsh birds, 4 eagles, and even for alligators, which was kind of unheard of in his day. And his early efforts have been one of the things that make the Yawkey Wildlife Center such a special place today, and such an easy place to share with people. A holistic management scheme wasn't necessarily just his idea. There was a few others in South Carolina that were doing similar, but most people just wanted their efforts to reflect those consumptive opportunities, hunting ducks, hunting deer, hunting turkeys, that sort of thing. But Yawkey realized that if you could increase the diversity of that system there, that it tended to offer stability. And not only stability, but sustainability over time and even growth. And so we've really seen that if we follow that same course of action that Yawkey initiates almost 100 years ago now, that we continue to make Yawkey a better and better place for all the different wildlife species that occur there. Yawkey understood the history of rice culture, but he wasn't content to just dwell on the history in the past, and he was always striving, like I mentioned, experimenting and researching, finding ways to improve as he went through time like this. Elise, part of this process as well, she loved to hunt and fish, and she wasn't just sitting on the porch or writing letters home or whatever. She was right out there in the field with him. Enjoyed the baseball, which we'll get into just a little bit later. They made their home in what was known as the Hunting Lodge on South Island. It had been built by Tom's Uncle Bill shortly after the turn of the century. It was a pretty spacious house, but you can see by the photograph there, kind of humble looking also. The front part of the house had a great room with a fireplace. You could look out across Winyah Bay and see North Island in the distance. The middle part of the house, like I said, built as a hunting lodge and a series of small bedrooms. They called them staterooms. And then the back of the house was where the kitchen and the dining area would have been. So pretty comfortable dwelling. And this is where Tom lives until 1957 when that house finally burned. Yawkey spent a lot of time just exploring that island. And there's not many days that we can find that he was idle unless it was just pouring rain and you weren't able to get around. And Elise, much the same way, just enjoyed the hunting and fishing opportunities. And from what I've been able to gather, just as good a shot with a rifle or a shotgun as any man of her time. And their daughter, Julie, would share this photograph with me of a Kodiak Bear she killed, one of the largest taken ever on one of their hunting trips up to Alaska. Pretty good shot with a camera as well, and captured a lot of interesting scenes, candid, shots of folks on Cat Island and South Island in the years that she's there. Still trying to figure out the identity of this young man, and so we'll keep circulating this photograph hopefully until we find out who he is. This guy we did put a name to, that's Charlie Porterfield, and it's just a wonderful photograph. So she gets them in all the different stages of life, and there's wedding photographs, even funerals, so right on to death like that. But wonderful that these photographs have been preserved. Be glad to share some with the library if you'd like to have them in the digital collection up here. I think Julie might like that. In 1936, Tom and Elise would adopt a young girl named Julie when she was just weeks old, and she, another soul that gets to grow up on South Island in kind of that golden era back then. And she becomes part of that family, just as Tom had been brought in when he was a young man, and now Elise, her mother, and now Julie, and some of the other children there as well. So once again, some really neat photographs of the kids growing up on South Island. She had a lot of friends there in the community, even talked about having a pet deer named Susie, who would eat out of her hand, which sounded like a tail until she shared me some photographs of that very deer on the island. And to this day, some of the deer on South Island act almost tame. They were unharassed for many generations out there. This is a photograph I took of Julie as she visited the church down there one day, and shown with a photograph of her parents there. Julie lives in a modest home up in Connecticut now. She'll be 85 this year, very healthy 85. And in the summer, she spends a good bit of time out west in Wyoming, where incidentally Tom had spent a good portion of his time as a younger man. But she told me that if she walks out the back door of her house there in Wyoming, there's just wildlife everywhere. And so very reminiscent of what she would have experienced growing up on South Island. Well, we can't talk about Tom Yawkey without talking about baseball a little bit. And one of my colleagues said, when you're giving those tours out at South Island, you don't need to talk about baseball because that happened up north and this was down south. But some of the baseball things did take place down south. And it starts off at a pretty early age. Tom Yawkey is introduced to Ty Cobb, one of the first baseball players inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame at an early age. And Ty Cobb takes a liking to this young man. And when his father passes away, of course, his father's the owner of the Detroit Tigers baseball team that Ty Cobb played for so long. Ty Cobb extended his hand and tried to spend more and more time with Tom. I've heard a lot of interesting things about Ty Cobb, who incidentally did play some ball right out there on Cat Island. and apparently gave an exhibition for the residents out there, at least on one occasion. But some of the stories that you hear about Ty Cobb just frankly aren't true. He wasn't near the ferocious monster. He's just a fierce competitor. But he does a lot of really neat things, especially after his baseball career is over. He starts a hospital. He starts an educational fund down in Georgia that are still going on today. And we see a pattern emerge later in life. Ty Cobb would come down, continue to come down and spend time with Tom and the rest of the characters there on South Island. You see Tom on the left here, and this is Ty Cobb, a much older Ty Cobb there in the center. This fellow on the end here is Joe Wheeler, made his home up in Marion. Joe was originally from Philadelphia and had made his money in Canadian silver mines and timber operations, particularly timber here in coastal South Carolina. But he's the one that brokers the deal where Yawkey becomes the owner of those outstanding shares of that South Island Hunt Club. I think if you go down to the courthouse and look it up, it'll say that enormous tract of land passed over to Yawkey for the sum of $5. We're confident there may have been some more cash involved in that, but it looks like they all were very much agreeable to that arrangement. In 1933, Tom Yawkey turned 30 years old, and he gets the bulk of his inheritance, about $20 million, which would have come through his Uncle Bill. And he decides to buy a baseball team. He originally wanted to purchase that same Detroit Tigers team that Uncle Bill had owned, but they weren't available that year. So he turned his sights to another successful franchise, the New York Yankees. And hours before he was to sign that contract to purchase the Yankees, he found out about the availability of another team. And so in 1933, Tom Yawkey purchases the Boston Red Sox for $1.2 million. When the Yawkey Foundation finally sold the Red Sox team in 2002, it went for a record of $694 million, which was a record for a purchase of a sports franchise at that time. And that's a pretty good return on that $1 million investment. And it seems to me that just about everything that Yawkey put his hand to went in a similar fashion because of the way he did things. He was very methodical, like scientific methodical, and never rushed into any sort of arrangement without a lot of careful thought and consideration. Fenway Park was part of that purchase in '33, and it was run down almost as bad as the team had been run down, and they'd lost a lot of talent, including one Babe Ruth, once a part of that Red Sox organization. But it's a beautiful park, and you had to rebuild it twice. Just after they had rebuilt it, and by '34, they had a bad fire and they ended up having to rebuild it again by '36. Tom is the one that built the Green Monster in Fenway Park. And I don't know if any of you have been to Fenway Park. It's a beautiful ballpark. Even if you don't like ballparks, you'll like Fenway Park. If you don't want to travel all the way to Boston to see one, there's one in South Carolina. It's a smaller version that stands in Greenville, South Carolina. And so you can take that in one way or another, I think. One of the early acquisitions of Yawkey's Red Sox was a fellow by the name of Ted Williams, the Splendid Splinter, he was known. And comes in a young man in 1939 and stays with the team until 1960, so had a good, successful career with the Red Sox. Left the team twice to serve in the military. And he's an aviator for the United States Marine Corps, both in World War II and in the Korea conflict. Had a great relationship with the Yawkeys, and on this lithograph, if we pull in close there, it says across the top, to Tom and Jean, two of the nicest people ever made. Best always, Ted Williams, 1961. And Ted Williams would also be the keynote speaker when Yawkey's inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1980, and begins his remarks by telling folks that Yawkey was just one of the greatest sportsmen of all time and a man that he loved. And a lot of bad press on Ted Williams from time to time regarding his temper. And didn't get along sometimes with the press too well, but did get along with the coaches and got along especially well with all of the other players on the team, even the very first black player to join the team in 1959. Tom would marry Jean Hollander in 1942. They had met up in New York where she worked as a fashion model, and Tom and Elise had already been separated by that time. And so they would marry on Christmas Eve, 1944, right here in the historic district in Georgetown, in the house that Linda Abate lives in now. And she has told me she's heard the tales of all the things that the Ford family did to prepare for this millionaire couple's wedding, and new wallpaper and just, you know, refurbishing and cleaning and make sure everything was just perfect. Worried that their clothes wouldn't be nice enough to host this millionaire couple even, and were somewhat disappointed when the future Mr. and Mrs. Yawkey showed up in their hunting clothes. But apparently there was enough baskets of champagne and caviar to make everyone happy as the evening wore on. So they really were kind of a magical couple, and they were together just everywhere they went. Georgetown, 6 to 8 months out of the year, Jean liked to tell friends that she enjoyed 3 springs each year. There was spring in Georgetown, and they would leave from here, travel to New York, maybe in May or so. And they took time in New York because that's where the family business was still located. And then after things had warmed up even more, they would make their way on up to Boston and stayed in a hotel near Fenway Park for the summer. But they didn't necessarily stay till the end of baseball season. As soon as things began to cool down a little bit back here, they came back on down, and they enjoyed spending as much time here as they could. Back in the 1930s, there was a young American artist who would travel to Georgetown from his family's home up in Pennsylvania. And he would spend time with his godparents who had a home on Cat Island, and actually completed this watercolor while he was there, and would enjoy great success later in life. His godparents, Mr. and Mrs. Phelps, lived in a home that would later be known as Blackout. And Andrew Wyeth spent many wonderful winters in Georgetown, and probably a lot of people don't know that. Kind of a quiet guy, apparently. And Blackout gets its name. You can see kind of a faint image of the house here. It's actually designed and built by a protege of Frank Lloyd Wright. So the closest thing Georgetown County had to a Frank Lloyd Wright home. In the early days of World War II, the Phelpses were approached by the Civil Defense Commission, and who cautioned them that their White House would be easily spotted there on the banks of the Santee Delta by German U-boats. It would obviously be operating in the nearshore waters. So Mr. and Mrs. Phelps decided to do their part for the war effort, and they painted their White House black with red trim to make it virtually invisible at night. And it became known after that as Blackout. In 1959, there was a young man from Georgetown. Oops, got ahead of myself. There was a young man from Georgetown who had just graduated from the University of South Carolina with an economics degree. And he comes back home to Georgetown and gets a job with a contractor who was making an addition onto Mr. and Mrs. Phelps's home. They built, among other things, a hexagonal library and to house their fairly immense book collection there. During the time that this young man is there, Mr. and Mrs. Phelps encourage him to go back to school and get his master's degree in wildlife biology. It's quite a drift to go from economics to wildlife biology, but that's what this young man did. And this young man was Phil Wilkinson of local fame here. And Phil credits Mr. and Mrs. Phelps in encouraging to go get his master's degree, which he did, and then having that master's degree, he was hired by the wildlife department, and then Tom Yawkey also would offer him a position. So that's how Phil becomes part of the Yawkey family. Now, one of the contributions Phil would offer to this place, Yawkey had experimented with a number of different water control structures. You know, Georgetown County had all the rice infrastructure at one point, but most of that had disappeared by the 1960s, and nobody really knew how these old water control structures had been put together. But Tom Yawkey challenged Phil to come up with the best solution for water control. It was a big part of what they did for the wildlife management. And Phil determined that the best model was the same one that the rice growers had used, you know, hundreds or more years ago. And so he actually disassembles one of those old rice field trunks and makes a set of plans. This is back in the 1960s. And from his set of plans that he hand drew back in the 1960s, we're still building these water control structures, or rice field trunks, as many people know them today. And there's literally hundreds of these around the county. And if you build them according to Phil's plans and take those extra steps that are necessary, they'll last a long, long time. That old technology was pretty well perfected, Phil says, by about 1820. And the only thing we've done to improve upon that is to use treated lumber and stainless steel hardware, perhaps. But it's that commitment to those engineering details that can make this such a birdapalooza out there today. So anybody that's been out knows this can happen on just about any given day because of all these advances and uses of technology. Phil, shortly after Yawkey dies, no longer works for the Yawkeys, of course, but he does still work for the Department of Natural Resources and begins to work with alligators. They had just recently been listed as an endangered species, and we didn't have a whole lot of information about them. But Phil started capturing, measuring, and marking alligators in 1980, some of which we're still recapturing and measuring today. There is international interest in the alligator research program there, started by Phil by about 1980 and still going strong today. Phil has even passed his love for wildlife and for alligators down to both his children, shown here his daughter, and also his grandchildren, his granddaughter in this photo as well. Phil didn't spend a whole lot of time with us this year because of the pandemic, but I fully expect he'll be back next year. Let's go back to 1959, and excuse me for going kind of back and forth in time, but I think it helps us to explore some of the different aspects of the Yawkey family and how all these things kind of fit together. But this photograph I showed you before, and I'll share with you again, is of Ted Williams and Pumpsy Green. Pumpsy Green holds the distinction of being the first black man to wear that Boston Red Sox uniform. This is 1959. The Red Sox hold the distinction of being the last team in Major League Baseball to hire a black player. And friends, if you took those two facts and put them in a vacuum and looked at it underneath a microscope, you would say, well, somebody must have been racist. Well, Tom Yawkey is the head of that organization, so guess what? People, after many, many years, began to circulate rumors that perhaps Tom Yawkey was racist. Well, it's simply not the case. If you examine what was going on in finer detail, you'll discover that there's actually no truth in that allegation whatsoever. Pumpsy Green is the first one to wear the Red Sox uniform, but 1950, the Red Sox had hired a black player who played in the minor league system. 1952, they tried to get a contract on another black player. Likewise, in 53, 54, 57, they actually signed a contract with a young man to come and play. Just before the season starts, he's drafted by the Marine Corps, and they wouldn't see him for a couple of years. Had he played even a little bit, somebody else would have been the last team in baseball. What you should also know is that by 1967, the Red Sox have the most diverse roster in all of baseball because they actually get a head start. The Red Sox are one of the first teams to hire a Native American player, one of the first teams to hire a Mexican player, and one of the first teams to hire a Puerto Rican player. He didn't hire people because they were black or white or Mexican or Puerto Rican. He hired them because they could do a job at the time, and the trades and the contract money and all that stuff worked out. That's the way the baseball thing goes on. But I think we should look just a little bit further. And the reason I want to do this is because there was a fellow up in Boston who was adamant that Yawkey was a racist and wanted to remove the sign beside Fenway Park that says Yawkey Way. And it had been erected by the citizens of Boston that wanted to memorialize the efforts and accomplishments of Tom Yawkey, both on and off the ball field. Let's look just outside that vacuum and go back off the microscope a little bit. This is the New York Yankees in 1961. How many persons of color can you see in that photograph? There's 28 men in that photograph. Only 2 of them are men of color, okay? This is 2 years after the Red Sox hired their first black player. So I want you to kind of see where this goes. I grew up in a little college town in the middle of North Carolina, and we had a basketball team that we were really proud of. They had won a national championship in 1957, had a lot of promising athletes on that team. In 1967, they offer a scholarship to the first black player in the Southeast. This is many years after, right? Further, and same said little small town in North Carolina, this gentleman, Howard Lee, would be elected mayor in 1969. He's the first black mayor in the Southeast since Reconstruction. He actually served 3 terms and then went on to serve as the commissioner of the Natural Resources Board in North Carolina. Pretty neat guy, no relation, by the way. But anyway, what I'm getting at is there were changes taking place everywhere, some a little bit earlier, some a little bit later. If you think racism was just confined to one particular area of the country, it was not. In 1960, the Red Sox traveled to sunny Scottsdale, Arizona for spring training. And as they're checking into the hotel, they're informed that Pumpsy Green will not be allowed to stay because he is black. And he was forced to stay in a hotel outside the city limits. So once again, when you examine this issue more in totality, you get a much better feel about what's going on. I can tell you this now with great certainty. There never, ever was a racist bone in Tom Yawkey's body. There was no racist thoughts, deeds, actions. It just was not in him. And that fellow up in Boston that wanted to change the name of the street was successful in doing so. He changed it to what it had been before it was named Yawkey Way. Jersey Street. Jersey Street is named for the Earl of Jersey, who was a notorious English slave trader. I think the law of unintended consequences applies here. So you went from Yawkey Way to Jersey Street. I don't know when they'll address this issue, but I'm sure it'll come up sooner or later. I can tell you this, when they took the Yawkey Way sign down, that there were a lot of people that were very disappointed, and a lot of them were angry because they thought a great injustice had been done. I was amongst those, and I immediately went out and bought a Yawkey Way t-shirt, and I bought me a Yawkey Way sign, so I would have my very own Yawkey Way sign that I could proudly display. But then it occurred to me that Yawkey Way is not just the name of a street beside a ballpark up in Boston. Yawkey Way is the manner in which Tom Yawkey conducts himself, both personally and professionally, throughout his entire life. The Yawkey Way I think, best described by a maxim that Tom Yawkey lived by. It's probably passed down from his Uncle Bill and still carries on. I think it's on the Yawkey Foundation homepage. Do the right thing, do it quietly, and never expect praise for being kind. So I think I'll take that over Jersey Street any day, so for what it's worth. And I don't mean to dwell on that too long. One of the neat gifts I got along the way from Phil Wilkinson, he described to me what a day in the life of Tom Yawkey might have been like. He said during his tenure there from 1966 until 1977 that Yawkey typically got up each morning about 4 a.m. and went to a particular well. It's not this well, but it would have looked similar to that, and got water to make his coffee. Once he had made his first cup of coffee in the morning, he walked into what was known as the Playroom at that time, and where his office was located. And he gets to work bright and early in the morning like that, 4:30 or so. And he's taking care of that family business up in New York with all the various mining and timber operations, running a baseball team up in Boston, and involved in all the day-to-day operations there on South Island. That little playroom, which looks much the same today as it did back during Yawkey's time. Most of the furnishings you see in that room date from the 1930s. But when the sun came up, or Yawkey saw the light over at the manager's house, he would slip out the back door, go to Phil's, and have a cup of coffee with him. And then after some of the workers had been given their marching orders for the day, they would pile into the Jeep or the Bronco, whichever the case might have been that particular day, and they would ride around and look at things. And Phil and I talked, and he said, you know, we wasted a lot of time just riding around looking at things. We could have been working on stuff. But Yawkey was adamant that each day that they get out and ride around and look at things, and he made it a part of his day. I don't know if Phil was aware, Yawkey records all of the observations that he makes along the way in his daily journals. He kept a journal every day of his adult life. And some of the observations are pretty mundane, but some of them, which birds, which ponds, what's the weather like, and he goes back and looks at these things. We still have many of these. They've never been released to the public, but I've had the pleasure of looking at them. And he was a careful observer of all that he saw going on around him. And he uses these, I think, to kind of connect the dots. And this is how he's able to come up with a comprehensive plan on how to best manage all the different aspects of this property. So whether he was perusing the beaches there on South Island or back in the woods somewhere reflecting on things that had already passed, a careful observer. And one interesting note, Phil said that when Ford came out with the Bronco, which was 1966. Yawkey decided that was the vehicle for him, and I think the Jeeps went on the wayside, and he would get a new Bronco each year, trade the old one in. There's still a couple of the old ones around, I think at least one in Georgetown County. Phil said Mrs. Yawkey drove a station wagon, and she would trade hers in every other year, and then Phil would buy the used one, and that's what he used to transport his family around. Incidentally, the last time Phil traded in a vehicle, he sold his old one to me, and that's what I drive around. So we keep it all in the family there. But when Yawkey's making these journeys around there, you know, he's not just seeing just the work that had gone on, but he tries to take in just about everything. You might see a bird or two along the way. Phil said that in the evening, Yawkey would often leave his house on South Island, travel back over to Cat Island. This is at the end of the workday. And he'd visit with these families that he's known over there for generations now. He knows them all. He knows them very well. So whether they're sitting on the porch, watching life go by, working in the garden, fishing somewhere on the property, always stopped and had time to speak and talk with them. Phil said there were probably instances along the way where somebody might just magically have a pound cake or a little bottle of rum to share with him. Gene didn't like him to drink or eat too many sweets in those days, he said, but those folks looked after one another just like family. And those long associations, of course, really a big part of who Yawkey was. And this fella, Joseph Collington, who we knew as Tiny, he's one of the last of those original Cat Island families. His family had lived on Cat Island for at least 5 generations that he could count. And I could show him some of these photographs from 1936, and he could identify people in those photographs because they'd been shared with him, and those family histories were alive and well. Joseph recently retired, and we had a little retirement dinner for him, and he got up and spoke, and he told us when he turned 18 that he traveled to Chicago, wanted to see what the world was like away from the island. Less than a year later, he was back in Georgetown. He said it was simply too cold up there, and he said the weather sucked also. What he told us was that there was an atmosphere of genuine love on Cat Island, unmatched anywhere else in the county or other places that he would visit. And when I came to work for DNR in 1982, I met some of the folks that were working on Cat Island, and they said, Jim, you ought to come over and join us. And I said, well, I've heard how bad the mosquitoes are. What else can you offer me? And they said, well, we have a chance to fish and catch shrimp. And they said, it's more like a family atmosphere here. We work together side by side. We celebrate each family's birthdays, and we celebrate Christmas together. I didn't realize it at the time, but they were still living that same lifestyle that Yawkey had helped promote early on. In the mid-40s, Tom Yawkey was approached by a delegation that was interested in building a hospital. With all the returning servicemen coming back to Georgetown, they knew they needed to meet those medical needs. They were hoping they'd get Yawkey to commit to $30,000 or $50,000. He got so excited he wanted to write a check for about $350,000 right off the bat. One of his mentors would temper that a little bit, and instead, the first year, he just wrote a check for $100,000. $100,000 in 1945 was a lot of money, especially if you gave another $100,000 the next year, another $100,000 the next year. And this is the way the hospital in Georgetown got built, was by the people of Georgetown, and of course one of those leaders and chief donors would have been Tom Yawkey. Recently, of course, the Yawkey Foundation have provided a $10 million donation towards the construction of the new surgical pavilion there at the hospital. And you know, if you'd have visited the hospital 10 years ago, you couldn't have found Yawkey's name anywhere. The foundation only recently decided to go ahead and put that Yawkey name on the things that Yawkey had invested in for so long. In 1976, Tom Yawkey was 73 years old, and Georgetown's Dr. Camlin diagnosed him with leukemia. And despite some very aggressive treatments at some of the finest institutions around the country, he didn't last very long. He would have spent his last days in a hospital up in Boston with his wife, Jean, by his side. And it's been told that during those last days, he got her to promise to take care of 2 things. First of which was take care of that property, and including some parcels that hadn't gotten his name on them yet. But the second thing he asked her to do was to win a World Series, and something that he hadn't been able to accomplish. Came real close. They played in 3 World Series during his ownership, but lost in Game 7 all 3 times. I'm sure a bitter pill to swallow like that. But he and Jean, over the years, had been making plans, and they had some really concrete ideas about what they wanted to do with the properties and with these projects that they'd gotten involved in over time. They knew that it would be the right thing to do to share some of the wonderful aspects of the property with the people of Georgetown. And so they give the property to the South Carolina Wildlife Department, and they set up Yawkey Foundation 1 to fund the operation. And so therefore the property is entirely state-owned, but since its inception in 1976, has been entirely privately funded. They never had to spend yours and my tax dollars in order to offer the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center to the public. And it carries a fairly large price tag. There's a number of wildlife management goals that have to be addressed all the time. More than 50 miles of road and dike to be maintained, and we're starting to be seriously challenged by some of the rise in sea levels and frequent storms that we're having, some to unbelievable levels at days. And but we'll continue to charge ahead. We burn about 3,000 acres on Cat Island each year. That's a fairly large undertaking. So you get the gravity of just the management side. Secondarily, we do a great amount of scientific research. This is where loggerhead sea turtle research begins in the Southeast, courtesy of Mr. Thomas Samworth, there on the right in the photograph, who got a journalist from Smithsonian Magazine to travel down to Georgetown in 1974 and did a feature article in Smithsonian Magazine, and that's how sea turtle research gets its good start. And of course, I mentioned the alligator research program that Phil started, the longest running alligator research program in the country, growing stronger each and every year under the direction of Dr. Thomas Rainwater now. But real proud of what he's been able to accomplish and from what Phil started. We've had researchers come from as far away as Tasmania to study birds and to share with us her methodologies for gathering information on some of these species that are very hard to photograph and very hard to count because they're so secretive. We have partnered with Horry Georgetown College, and the students that are in that wildlife forestry program spend a lot of time on the island. Of course, the Yawkey Foundation helped to start that program and fund it for many of its first years. The students are able to use the property for labs, and they also come out regularly for volunteer events. So we can get to know them, they can get to know us, and get to know about some of the resources here in our area. Kind of the third thing that Yawkey wanted to leave to the people was a way to enjoy the property in conjunction with those other two important missions, the wildlife management and the wildlife research. So educational opportunities are fairly abundant now. I think at last count, not counting this pandemic year, but about 100 field trips a year for a lot of different people, some scholastic groups. Some people would just want to see some of the historic resources, cultural resources on the property. Others just like to see things that fly and the flowers that grow there. A few unexpected surprises along the way for some folks. And coming up soon, we've got a new archaeological initiative taking place. With help from the National Park Service, they'll be hitting the ground running, I think, in February. And hope to be able to include the public on some of those events if we can get our pandemic here under control. Trips to North Island, enjoying that scenery, both in and around that magnificent lighthouse out there. However you do this, and there's a lot of different ways to see it. If you're mobile enough, I do walks through the forest, and if you're just comfortable just riding on the bus, we can do that. We do get out in the boat from time to time. There's just a lot of ways to enjoy it, and I haven't been able to do the number of field trips, of course, because of the pandemic that I'd like to, but I'll tell you this for folks that are in attendance, whether you're seeing this live today or hopefully in the next week or two. If you can see my email address and my phone number there, if you'll call me and let me know what you're interested in, I'll try my best to accommodate you and share the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center, all those wonderful resources that Tom and Jean Yawkey left behind for us. I did want to mention a couple books while I've still got your attention, and then I think we're going to have time for some questions. Is that correct? Okay. For those of you that are purely interested in Tom Yawkey, this is a wonderful volume. I think this is probably in the library here on some days, but a great volume. It focuses a lot on the baseball aspect of Tom Yawkey's life. But if you like baseball, if you want to understand some of the things surrounding that controversy up in Boston and the alleged racism and all that. This is a great volume to read, and also just get to know Tom a little bit better. There's a fellow down in Charleston who recently published a book. He's one of our frequent visitors and touts himself as the world's biggest Red Sox fan, but grew up in Boston, was involved in sporting events up there, knew about the sports culture and also what was going on racially, and has been a high school guidance counselor down in Charleston for more than 30 years and wrote this book. They call me the Pathfinder. And if you don't have this in the library yet, this needs to become a part here. But this is great reading also, and helps us understand what was going on in those tumultuous years, and how we can be a part of the solution as well. And then last but not least, this little volume called The Nature Fix, offered to me by my friend John Simmons from Wofford College. And this will tell you in greater detail how beneficial it is to spend time outdoors, whether it's riding around or walking on the beach or going through that walk in the forest. In fact, gives explicit details on the physiological changes that take place when you raise your immunity to diseases like coronavirus simply by walking in the woods a little bit. So come on out to Yawkey. We'll put on a mask and go for a walk in the woods, and we can talk about this one later if you like.
Jim, I want to thank you very, very much for an outstanding presentation. Very informative and helpful, and learned so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. You have one more object you have to explain.
Oh yeah, I did, and I missed this one along the way. This is just an old bottle I found out in the woods walking around at Yawkey, and you probably can't see this. It says Big Frosty across the front there. Big Frosty was an experimental product of the Coca-Cola company back in the 1920s. And I found a number of these bottles, many of them in pieces, but on one particular section of Cat Island where a sawmill had once stood. And I think it's much more than just coincidence that Ty Cobb was a major stockholder of the Coca-Cola company during that same era. And I think it's probably likely that Ty Cobb brings a few cases of Big Frosty down for the boys out on Cat Island to enjoy on one of his trips down there. Kind of a neat thing to see. There's a lot of historical little items like this scattered all throughout the property. So come on out and enjoy. No telling what we might learn about out there on Cat Island.
Jim, do I recall as well that there is a scholarship component to Yawkey's contribution to the area?
There is. Each year, at least 2 students from each of the area high schools will have one senior, usually a male and a female is the way they try to do it, that receive scholarships through the Yawkey Scholarship, which we could cover that on another time.
Okay.
That's kind of out of my league.
Okay, and also some some questions came in through Facebook. The foundation planned to share those journals, the diary that he was keeping. We'd be glad to have those publicized and shared.
I don't know if they're interested in doing that at this point. Maybe at some time in the future. And the reason why they wouldn't do that is because some of it may contain personal information. So more than just, if it was just the wildlife observations, I think they'd be glad to share that.
We could do it like federal, they could be blacked out, the portions that are.
Yeah, so that's why I was able to share that one page, is because it dealt more with just the natural history and that sort of thing.
And the personnel here at the library said they'll be very, very glad to have those photos to be able to preserve for the future.
I'll be glad to work with the personnel up here to make sure they have access to those photos.
Well, Jim, thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate very, very much. We need to do the
There we go.
safe one. But thanks, Jim, for a wonderful presentation, recommendations for visits, as well as recommendations for further reading and study and research. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Appreciate
Thank you.
it.